Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we share ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalahi. I'm your host here. My guest for this episode is Mike Zavershnik. Mike and I have been working together for about 6 months. At this point in time, he's a real estate developer, but it wasn't always like that. He started out as a professional athlete. He had an education in economics. He worked in tech-incubator company, and he was one of the founders way back in the .com era. He moved to real estate investing about 10 years ago. Started as a real estate investor by buying up some multiplexes in the GTA area. After about 10 years, his portfolio has risen to about more than 300 units in GTA. The company he owns and runs is 17A properties. And recently, in the last few years, he has ventured into the world of development, and that's where the both of us met, and we're currently working on one of his projects. In this episode, he obviously walks us through his background. He talks about what was his secrets in terms of succeeding in real estate investing and going from 0 to 300 units in a 10-year period, which is a feat of itself, at least in Toronto and GTA, with the prices that we have currently going and we've had for the past decade. He talks about some of the myths and misconceptions about real estate development, how to help and shift that image and how to improve the image. He's also very active and he's very vocal about the changes that are required in the housing policy to help the housing crisis. We've had multiple conversations about this offline, Mike and I, and this one is obviously for the podcast, but we've been talking about that, how the changes are not happening fast enough, although there are changes, and we've talked about this on this podcast before, that there are some good changes that have happened over the past few years, but perhaps we need more and we need quicker changes to come to fruition. We talk about different technologies in construction and how they can help solve the housing crisis. We talk about the role of municipal regulations and relationships in getting project approvals for good or bad. That's what it is. And the true impact of development charges and how they're weighing some of these projects down and what can be done about it. As always, you can find more information about Mike and our episode on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. If you're listening to this episode and if you're enjoying it, please remember to subscribe. And if you're liking it even more, please make sure to tell others about it and help us grow the show. As always, we appreciate your support. Thank you. Hey, Mike. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Hey, Payam. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you for being here. You and I have been working for about 6 months or so together on one of your development projects. This has been a pleasure so far. Hopefully for the same for you, and we'll continue going down that road. Before we dive into our conversation and we go through your background, what you're doing, and some of the ideas and experiences that you have, why don't we start by giving our audience a little bit of introduction about who's Mike, what have you been up to, what's your background, where you're coming from, and we go from there.
Sure. Great. Well, thanks again for having me. Look, first of all, I have to say the best part about our project so far has been working with you on it, for sure. So
I appreciate
everything else. Everything else has been more challenging, but working with you has been great. So I've been in the GTA most of my life, and I have an economics degree. But I think when I think about it, I would describe myself mostly as being pretty entrepreneurial.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's I haven't always thought that all along, but looking back, I think that's a pretty good description of my career. I thought I wanted to work on Bay Street when I was in university, but I pretty quickly discovered that I don't think I had the math chops or the right disposition for that kind of career. So I started to think about other things I was going to do. After university, I joined 3 friends and we started a company that was a kind of incubator to try to help other companies get started. That quickly evolved into a software company. And, I don't have any tech background. I didn't have any tech background at the time, but I started to get involved with the creation of the software while I was working with that group. And unfortunately, that company didn't succeed. Our timing was pretty bad. We launched not too long after the .com bubble burst in 2000. So after that, I had to figure out what I wanted to do next. And it was either go into finance or pursue the tech side of things. And ultimately, I decided to stay with tech. And to took a couple of jobs with small software companies in what is called product management. I didn't know it was called product management at the time, but it's called product management. And I really enjoyed those jobs because a product manager in software sort of sits, but it's like a little mini CEO, and they sit between the customers and the developers and the marketing team and the sales team, and they sort of own the products and have to communicate to all aspects of the company with regards to those products. So I got to be entrepreneurial even in the context of a larger company. I really enjoyed that. I did that for a number of years. But I think I always really wanted to do something that was my own, and didn't have any ideas in software. And so I decided to look into real estate. And I have a bit of a family background in real estate. My grandfather, when he came over from the old country in the Second World War, eventually he became a house builder. And so maybe there's a bit of a real estate gene coursing through my veins.
Emotional connection, at least.
Yeah, exactly. It's actually where the name 17A Properties came from. So I started to invest in real estate first on the side, and then brought investors together to start to acquire multifamily properties, building in Barrie, and then a building in Burlington, and then a building in Kitchener. And after having a few successful projects under my belt, I decided to branch out on my own and launch 17A Properties. I've been doing that full time since 2013. Right now, I've got a nice team together. We've got almost 300 units in our portfolio that we own and manage, and I'd say the portfolio is probably worth about $80 million worth of real estate at the moment. So it's been a nice run. The last few years have certainly been a bit more interesting or a bit more challenging than the first 10.
Perfect. That's pretty impressive. Before we dive into the whole real estate development aspect of things, what was your one key or two keys in success in what you've done for the past 12 years?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I think that what stands out to me, which I really didn't anticipate, was the importance of relationships and your network. When I don't come from I don't have a trust fund that I'm using to buy this real estate. So I'm going out to my network and my friends and family to try to find investors to purchase these properties with me that I can manage on their behalf. And if you don't have good relationships with people, you're not going to have an opportunity to have those conversations. And a number of people told me how important trust was in their decision to make an investment with me, above and beyond whether or not the numbers looked good. Just their trust in me as a person was not something I had anticipated, and it's been certainly a nice benefit that has come out of the process.
So, Mike, you have interesting background. Athletic person, you've been in sports, and I'm going to guess basketball just because of physical features.
What gave that away? Yeah, basketball and baseball are my two main sports.
Baseball. And so you did that. You went to software. You had encounters, successful or not. You learned your lessons. You picked up all of a sudden in real estate, and by all accounts, I would say from someone who is starting from scratch less than 15 years ago, going from a zero portfolio to 300 unit portfolio of landlordship or ownership in real estate, it's not shabby at all. It's a pretty decent curve, at least in my opinion. And I know a lot of people, and you and I have had this conversation before, that I know a lot of people who move the other way around. And by that, I mean, you're moving from the landlord side, the ownership side, to becoming a developer, to real estate development, which is what we need these days. We need more developers, more entrepreneurs, more investors to come in and each, to whatever extent they can, put a dent into this housing crisis or the affordability crisis that we have right now. Why are you doing that? Why are you going from the landlord, which is presumably a cushioned condition, I would say, situation, risk condition? You have cash flow, you have properties, they're going to praise well over years to come, and they're going to appreciate. Why go from that to
becoming a developer, which for all intents and purposes is on the other end of the spectrum of risk?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. When I first got into buying real estate, I assumed it was going to be a cash flow business. That the rents that we would bring in would be greater than the expenses. And I quickly learned that that's difficult to achieve. I think that there's there of landlords as wearing a top hat and just very wealthy, and at times not particularly lucrative, especially from a cash flow perspective. So pretty quickly after I started acquiring properties, I realized that I needed to figure out ways to add value to the properties. And you can add value to an apartment building in a variety of different ways. You can grow the revenue and you can cut expenses. And you can cut expenses in a bunch of different ways. But the things that I like doing the most were finding efficiencies that maybe the previous owners hadn't unlocked. So that could be energy efficiencies through water conservation or hydro conservation, or maybe a more efficient boiler, or something like that.
Just anything debugging the system or troubleshooting the system, I guess. That's a software break.
Hey everyone, Payam here. Just a quick announcement before we go back to the rest of the interview. We have been working on something new at midrise.ca. For those of you who have followed my work throughout the years, you know that I'm very passionate about the mid-rise buildings and the part that they can play in solving our housing crisis issues in Toronto and Canada. And I've had the good fortune and opportunity of working on a number of different mid-rise buildings and study a whole bunch of different systems that work for these buildings, the pros and cons of each system, how they affect the schedule, how they affect the cost, how they affect the performance of each building, and what stages they need to kick in. We have started a new webinar series. It's called Mid-Rise Building Solutions. And we plan to present and review some of the systems that hold the most promise for the mid-rise building typology in each webinar. If you want to learn more, these are all free resources. Please go to our website, midrise.ca. That's mid-rise.ca. And again, thank you for your support.
Well, there's a lot of reasons why a long owner wouldn't want to invest in those kind of things, because it's capital intensive. I get that, but when a building would change its hands, it's a good opportunity for a new owner to go in there and invest some capital. And then on the revenue side of things, you have the opportunity to take rents up. We can have a conversation about rent control in Ontario, but typically when you buy a building, you've got the majority, if not all of the tenants who are on rents that are below market rent. But what we would choose to do is renovate and improve those units to try to get them up to market rents. And that's what we started with the value creation on apartment buildings. And that was great and very successful. But then on top of that, the thing that I started that was really enjoyable, I found really interesting, was where you would take underutilized space within a building, whether it was a storage room, a locker room, an office, and try to apartments. That added a ton of value. And so I started doing that. I did that at Burlington, where we converted garages into a couple of new units. I did it in St. Catharines, where we converted space. We even took some 3-bedroom units and we turned them into 2 1-bedroom units. And that was really my first taste of larger scale, beyond just a renovation and into what you might consider to be development. I enjoyed, also very financially successful. So I started to look for more and more projects where I could do that kind of thing. That's how that came in. And if I tie it back to what I liked about my career in software, was there was a creative element to making software, where you would take the challenges of your customer to the development team and try to come up with a creative solution to their problems. That was something I very much enjoyed. I found that development is kind of a physical example of that same thing. So instead of creating software on a screen, you're actually turning it into a physical unit. I really enjoyed doing that. And so that was my first taste into it. That's how I expanded into it. And once I got a taste for it, I just wanted to keep doing more of it. And that's where some of my current projects have come from, and my future aspirations for doing more as well.
So you went through an existing building and started looking for places to create efficiencies, places to debug and troubleshoot, and a forced appreciation, basically. Create a forced appreciation on the property. Next step is, okay, I have some What can I push it for? Or I should say, how far can I push it in terms of developing an existing property? So you and I have been working on a project together for the past, I want to say about 6 months now, where you have extra land on the property and you're trying to intensify it. And it has been challenging for multiple reasons. And throughout the years, I know you've been working on that for a number of years right around. I want to start by this question that, like you mentioned, there's a misconception probably about landlordship and the landlords with the monopoly character that you just mentioned. Right. And what has been so far, in your experience, the biggest misconception about real estate development or the developers?
About real estate development. It's a good question. I think real estate developers coming into it being new, not considering myself a developer, I've never really understood why they seem to have a bad reputation in the space. They need a bit of a PR makeover. It seems to me that they really get penalized for wanting to create product and run a profitable business in ways that other industries don't. I don't quite understand it. I do appreciate that when you go into a neighborhood or you go into an area and you change the physical makeup of an area, that can be a very meaningful and impactful thing to the residents of that area. In general, I don't know. I would love to see some market research on this, but I'm sure after like banks and telecoms, I'm sure real estate developers are probably third on the list of least liked industries. And I just don't quite understand, especially in this time, at this time when we need as much housing as we can get.
Easy targets, I guess, right? Easy targets, the big bad developer. And for all intents and purposes, I'm pretty sure you can find good and bad in the mix if you look too close, or if you look closely enough. But to your point, we are in a situation that at the end of the day, we need houses, we need people to come in, put in the capital, bring creativity, bring entrepreneurship, bring the energy to take on and start solving it one block at a time, one project at a time. And I guess with that being said, you and I have talked about this before, and you had brought up the idea of building condos versus building rental buildings. Or another way of putting it is putting housing ahead of home ownership. I think that's how I had heard you describe it. Maybe walk us through that idea. Like, what are we talking about there?
Well, what I mean by that is there's a lot of noise around housing affordability right now. And I know that housing in Canada is like our second pastime, or real estate is second past after hockey, it seems like, right? Everyone loves to talk about real estate. They talk about home ownership. And I just think that's a real challenge for us as a culture to get past that, because I think it's kind of unrealistic for the idea that everyone is going to be able to own a home, or it's certainly going to be difficult for everyone to be owning a single family home with a front and a backyard and a driveway someplace. Mm-hmm. And as long as we can keep looking at it through that lens, I think we're limiting ourselves with solutions.
Right. So in other words, take a more realistic look at the surroundings. I want to go on a limb and say that's an evolution of a society in a sense as well. Like if you go back 100 years ago, probably each family or each landlord had owned acres and acres of land with a farmstead house in the center and farmlands and stables and everything. And you gradually go from that end of the spectrum to the single family dwelling or a semi-detached house, which was the norm for decades in Canada. But that, if you compare that to what people used to own 100 years ago, the ones who used to own, it's a much smaller scale, which is a more realistic scale at that point in time. And I agree with you that industry is significantly changing right now. Like even for myself on the construction side, I can notice that a lot of these smaller single family houses and semis and even stacked townhouses are becoming more and more difficult to build just because of the price of the land. And right. I think eventually we're going to see it come to a point that it's less affordable and it becomes even a more luxury product to compare to its comparatives. And I guess going back to your point, there's a point in time that I think there needs to be a decision as a society, I guess, made that do we want to end up with shoeboxes of 400 square feet for a family, but which you can own, or you could be a renter and you can rent a space, let's say 800 square feet, 900 square feet in the same apartment, in a building, but forego some of the luxuries. Is that how you look at it?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I just want to say, by the way, this is coming from someone who is fortunate enough to own a home, right? So right. I don't take for granted that what side of the ledger of that I'm on, that we purchased our home over 20 years ago. And so we're in a fortunate position. But, I know that real estate's obviously had a great run for a long time, and it has sort of been a rite of passage here in Canada, where you come out of school, you find a partner, you get married, you get a home, you start to have kids. These are like the stages of adulthood that we've come up with here in Canada. And I know we're not New York City, but there are other places in the world where that natural evolution doesn't have to be the case, where there are other places around the world where renting is not considered a failure on the part of a person in terms of them becoming a fully formed adult in the way that it is in a lot of cases here in Canada. And, the other thing that I think about is this whole renting versus owning as an investment. I do. I think everybody thinks that if you're renting, you're throwing money away. You're paying your landlord's mortgage and you're not getting anything out of it. And there are plenty of smarter people than me out there who talk about how that's not necessarily the case, that putting renting and putting the other money aside into investments can be equally as, if not more, lucrative. And also, people don't often take into account the other aspects of owning a home. They think mortgage payment versus rent, and that's the full equation. They don't take into account property taxes, insurance, and of course repairs and maintenance over the life of the new roof over the life of owning a home. So I just think it would be helpful in trying to solve this situation we're in if we could have a bit of a cultural shift in the way we think about having somewhere to live versus just home ownership.
How would we go about that?
Oh, that's way above my pay. Sorry, if you expected me to come on here and give you that answer, I'm afraid I don't know that I have that one. I think that's look, part of it is it's happening whether we like it or not, because there's affordability issues and just fewer people can afford a home. So the culture may shift by default. What I mean, the challenge in the meantime is all the hand wringing that's taking place. Like, what's going to happen? All these people are forever out of the home ownership market. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, great. It'd be nice if they could own a home, but can we just find them someplace to live? How about that as a reasonable goal to have? I mean, right now we're at record levels of people in their 20s and early 30s who are still living at home with their parents or have gone back home after living with their parents. So maybe there's another goal that we can have, which is just finding affordable housing for people to have that may not be home ownership, and that may be considered a success.
Yeah, and that's political platform for someone to run on. Put housing in front of ownership, which is a logical idea. I'm not an expert in this space, but there are taxation rules in place that make home ownership more viable or beneficial than renting. So if we wanted to change that, there could be some more rules around renting that could help change those things. Incentivize the housing types. Okay, and I know in our past experiences, you and I have talked about incremental changes that have been happening, and that's where I was poking to see if you want to go there, because you mentioned to me during one of our conversations that you actually don't think that incremental changes that are happening right now with the regulations. And let's say the whole thing with the zoning and major streets in Toronto, for example, right? Or the multiplexes. We were not fully sure that's actually a good thing. And maybe walk us through that, or did I get that right?
Well, what I mean by that is there's lots of talk about the housing crisis that we have. There's lots of politicians that are out there. There's lots of policy changes that are being rolled out in an attempt to address the situation. But as far as I can tell, we're not addressing the situation. And I get that this is a very complex problem to solve. So there are no easy answers. Let me start with that caveat. But if we truly are in a crisis, then policy tweaks are not something that's going to solve this problem. We need large-scale solutions so that we can create as much housing as we can. I think I've come to learn that this is not a supply side issue alone. If I talk about my economics degree, I used to think it's all about supply. It's all about supply side, and it's more complicated than that. But it sure seems like a good place to start with just trying to make more housing. And I'm in Toronto, and they've got the EHON policy, which is out, and lots of tweaks within that to try to create more housing, whether or not it's laneway, multiplex, now major streets. And as far as I can tell, there's not a huge uptake in any of those things, which is a real problem. And I get frustrated, and I said this to you when we were talking one time. I mean, when government decides that they want to solve a problem, there's enough money to solve it. Where there's a will, there's a way. If you look at something like, I know this was a very extreme example, but when COVID came around, we did whatever we needed to do and spent whatever money we needed to spend because we were in a crisis then. And if we truly are in a housing crisis now, then it seems to me that a response of that magnitude might be necessary. And governments of all levels work together to try to get us through that. And I don't know that I feel that governments at all levels now are helping to try to solve the housing situation.
Right. And I agree with you that it seems like a consistent or strong or overarching will, if you may, has been lacking or is lacking to make this an urgent dent and make it an urgent dent in the issue, and basically coming up and besieging all resources in one direction to make this happen. And I think the point was that these changes, all the things that you mentioned, and we have explained a whole bunch of these on previous podcast episodes, that there are lots of little changes that have been, and maybe they're little is not the word, but incremental is probably the better one to use, have been happening. But I guess the point is we don't want them to make us complacent. Right? Like just because we passed the EHAN, some of the regulations, to your point, I've been asking around, did this multiplex change in the city of Toronto, which hypothetically could open up tens of thousands of units? How many are actually happening? I'm searching for people. I know probably around a dozen of them are happening, but that's not the magnitude that we need if we want to actually do something about the problem. And part of me wants to think, going back to the misconception that we started with, is that too much development, too much movement, it also doesn't help people get reelected. Like if you're a councillor and you're actually voting for too many changes in your neighborhood, it probably shoots you in the foot down the road when time comes for the next election, because you've made a lot of enemies for yourself. So it's unfortunately one of those situations that you're bound. You need one. I think we talked about this before, that it seems like you need someone on a higher level, and it's not a councillor, it's not a mayor, it's something at a higher level to be basically given authority to, you guys, go ahead. Here's your small army of bureaucrats or technicals or whoever you need. Go ahead, get this thing done, and you don't need to worry about getting reelected in 4 years, right? And that's what we're missing.
Sure, it would be great if we had, let's call it a housing czar, someone who could impact all the way up and down through the various levels, federal of financing, zoning, building code, all of these things. That would be great. I think that's a bit of a pipe dream, unfortunately. I thought that there was a wind of change that might be happening in local politics. I mean, I know we in part got ourselves into this problem because local politicians were hesitant to approve projects because they would get pushback from a small but vocal minority of their constituents, and in order to keep their position, they would often push back on development projects. And quite frankly, I think that's in large part how we got here. And I was hoping that in recent years that the winds of change were happening, where actually local politicians weren't going to get punished for approving projects, but they were actually going to be encouraged to do so. I'm not sure that's actually the case. There's maybe that's stalled a little bit, but I certainly have been frustrated at the provincial level about what's been happening. I know that the current government talked a lot about housing and housing targets and the number of homes that were going to be built on certain timelines, including a bunch of affordable ones. And they've basically missed on all of those targets, haven't delivered on those things. And the policy changes they've rolled out, again, have been kind of biting our edges, with the exception of maybe, the HST thing, that was a federal thing. And they're not going to be punished for it. As far as I mean, I don't know what's going to happen when we're recording. The election is tomorrow, right? And so I don't know what's going to happen, but it seems like the Ford government will get reelected. I don't know. And when you look at the polling, housing affordability, housing is not at the top of the list of people's priorities. Affordability is, or cost of living, but housing is third or fourth down the list. So it feels like even this housing crisis has lost a little bit of momentum recently, and that's not a good thing. We've got fewer housing starts than we did 3 years ago. We're way behind other provinces in the terms of housing starts, and that's going to have a long-term impact on us economically. People are moving out of Ontario to find other places to live.
And that's a very big ticket. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's a very big ticket. Like I think it's underestimated how much of a long-term effect that's going to have on the economy. Like at the end of the day, our economy is a very great part of it's affected by the inward migration of incoming new people. which due to multiple reasons, it has slowed down. It had a bump. It's now slowing down. Inflation doesn't help it. Potentially a recession will definitely not help it. Housing,
Sure.
non-affordable housing definitely hurts it. So
Right.
it's time to wake up.
Yeah, the problem will potentially solve itself in some way if people leave the Greater
Yeah.
Toronto area, businesses leave the Greater Toronto area, new Canadians don't settle in the Greater Toronto area. In that sense, the problem will solve itself, but that's not going to help our prosperity, our overall prosperity in the region.
Yeah, that's very true. And at the end of the day, it's going to undermine everything that people like yourself have devoted their life building around it in Toronto, GTA, and Ontario for the most part, right? And okay, so moving forward from that, I want to go back. I want to go back to your transition from landlordship to development, because now, in a way, you're involved in a full-scale development project, and you have been involved in this project for years, I think. And what's the one thing you wish you had known before you pulled the trigger on this particular project that you have in the ground right now, or in the process right now? What was the one thing you wish you had known?
I wish I had the political connections from the beginning of the process, because ultimately, and I think this is part of the challenge with the system we have right now, is you shouldn't have to have political connections to have a housing project move forward.
Right.
And in this particular case, that's in large part how I was able to get the zoning done, because I connected with the right people and they were able to help me move the application through the planning department.
Okay, so you, in other words, if I rephrase, you wish you had known the importance of meeting the right people in the municipality from the get-go.
That's correct.
Is that a fair way of putting it?
I think that's fair, but further to that, I don't think it should be that way.
Oh, I don't disagree.
It shouldn't take that. It shouldn't take that a project through. But yes, that's the thing that I wish I had known that I needed from the beginning. I was naive and I just thought, this is a good project. I'll be able to make an application and we'll discuss it with the planning department and move forward. I was very naive.
Yeah. Okay. Lessons learned. These are lessons learned through the process. So we talked about the doom and gloom quite a bit. Is there anything that you're seeing in the industry from the technology, from the economic forces, or any other thing that makes you excited and say, you know what? Yes, we have a ton of issues. We have all this that we just talked about, but I see a little bit of light coming through the end of the tunnel, or no light?
There's not much light at the moment. No, what I would say in terms of positivity in the space is, I'm still a technology guy at heart, I suppose, with a software background, and I do think that there's technologies that can help with the efficiencies of some of these of the building construction methodologies. There have to be ways to speed up construction and reduce costs, right? If we're going to make the numbers work on a development project, there's only so many levers to pull, and speed of construction is one of those. And so I'm hoping that some of the new technologies can really be streamlined and brought into the mainstream. Things like modular housing, prefabricated components, just to make things go up more quickly. That's one thing that I'm hopeful for.
Right. Okay, that's good. And if we go back and give you the magic wand, we have a magic wand question on this podcast. If we were to give you a magic wand and say, Mike, for a day take your pick. You're the mayor, you're the councillor, you're the premier or the president, the prime minister, or even the president, who knows, of this region, and you can change one law, grant one exception to someone to make this problem a little bit better, or make the solution a little bit more likely, what would that be?
I only get one?
Please. We can talk to Jeannie, see if we can get you 3, but let's start with 1.
Oh boy, that's a tough one because as I said, the challenge is so multifaceted. I don't know that there's one thing, but maybe a bit of a mindset change on behalf of I'm going to say everybody, but primarily within the municipalities. A mindset change to finding ways to help projects move forward. My experience has been that the municipalities are mostly involved with looking for ways to say no or to slow things down.
What do you think that is?
Pardon me?
Why do you think that is? What led you to think?
So we may have a culture. It might be just a cultural problem. I mean, these people are all well-intentioned and capable people trying to do jobs. I don't doubt any of those things. But through all the rules and all the regulations, all we end up doing is really slowing things down in the name of process, in the name of safety, in the name of whatever. And we result in very few things getting done. When I was in software, we used to have the saying is that people never got fired for buying from IBM. Okay, that dates me a little bit because IBM. But point being is that IBM was such a big name that if you were up against them and somebody bought their product instead of yours, the person purchasing that software wasn't going to get in trouble by their bosses for purchasing IBM because of course they're IBM. So why not? And I kind of think it's the same way in this space. I don't think that anybody gets in trouble for saying no to a project or for slowing a project down or for not hitting a timeline on a project, right? And so it would be great if we change that mindset and we're like, how can we move these things forward? How can we say yes? How can we get a shovel into the ground? How can we make this happen instead of find reasons for it not to happen?
I guess it's the question of how do you incentivize the people in charge of making those decisions to actually want to make those decisions quicker, faster, in the right direction, as opposed to be worried about, am I going to get scrutinized 2 years down the road or for something like this? And I want to say back in one of the episodes, I think it was Jonathan Diamond that mentioned something that resonated with me, is that it seems at some point in time, our system's goal changed from solving a housing crisis to optimizing for like dozens and dozens of sub goals, which each of them, if you want to optimize for, is going to slow down the overall process. And that's another way of explaining what you just said. And it's, I guess, another way of mistaking the trees in the forest, I think, right? Like we're trying to make sure the trucks turn, make sure there's capacity, make sure everyone's happy, make sure. And I have to admit, this has gotten a little bit better. We had to make sure the shadow study didn't cover 30 minutes over 36 days in a year. A whole bunch of different requirements that have loosened up a little bit. But to your point, at the end of the day, it's one of those conditions that we want to make sure we get to the destination. It might be less than perfect, but we get to someplace rather than having to wait for 6-7 years, or in your case, to try and get a perfect project, which frankly prevents many of these projects
from moving forward at all. Yeah, it might be something, Payam, where these things are often set for the tone or the vision is set from above. Okay, and so maybe the new city planner, whose name I can't think of right now in Toronto, thank you. Maybe he'll come in and he can change the culture of that whole department and change it to what you and I are talking about, where they are incentivized to get things done, incentivized to get things through instead, and maybe even penalized. I don't want to say penalized for not doing them, but how about just incentivized for moving things through? Maybe he can impact that kind of change throughout the organization, so that the individual employees who are well-intentioned, again, they're well-intentioned, feel like they're enabled to push things forward.
And that's an important point, because I don't think there's any malintent in all of my dealings with all of the projects, with all the professionals at the municipalities that we deal with. You never get the feel that they have bad intent and they don't want you to do something. It's just they need to be extremely careful in meeting that radius and the capacity and the clearance and the encroachment or density. It's just too many things that need to be dotted to the almost perfection, which prevents the whole train from being able to move forward.
And they might also be sort of slaves to the process too, right? They're not allowed to deviate from the process. It has to follow the steps very carefully. Otherwise, it can't proceed. Let me ask you that question. Why do you think that they are so cautious about, we're in this radius for this tree or this parking spots or something like that? Why do you think they're hesitant to make any accommodations?
I think it goes back to what you just mentioned. So I'll take it broader even. So I think in one of the episodes we had Andrew Franchik talk about the old bylaws that we have in the city. So there are certain bylaws that were put in place in 1950s that still are overarchingly dictating what you and I do today with 67 years later. And because no one has had the time or will or ability to go back and say, listen, this needs to get we go to the root of this thing and just dig it up and clean it up and make sure it matches. It's been always tweaking. I guess it goes back to the earlier conversation we were having, that it has gotten tweaked over the years. Sometimes these tweaks are just so much. Sometimes they just layers upon layers.
Sure.
And frankly, on the other side of it is that, I don't know how to say this without sounding too political here, but there have been people, and I want to go back, and I hate to say this on the development side, I've seen a lot of it, unfortunately, that have misused, I think is the best word to use, the entitlement process. Whereas now they would go in, you buy something for $4 million, you put entitlement on top of it, sell it for 10, then redo entitlement again, then go back, and it keeps continuing and push the limits on all the regulations, which I think to a certain point would put the municipality on defense. Rightfully so. In this case, I would agree with them, because it just doesn't make sense if you are pushing the limit. And we've talked about on how far you push it on this podcast quite a bit with different guests, that I think, and you would probably, you and I actually are having this conversation right now. How much is enough? Do you go for another floor? Do you go for four more floors? Do you go for 60% of the site? Like, what is that? And so I think there's a balancing act. So I don't want to put the municipalities or the people in charge at fault, but at the same time, it seems like it's a cobweb that has been created over the years, and now they're stuck in it. We're stuck in it. Right. And as a society, we're all stuck in it. So to your point, maybe we just need that czar.
Yeah, I don't know how you untangle that. For sure, it's a complex problem, and I don't know how you untangle all of those things. But we have to try to come up with something. We need housing solutions across the whole spectrum. We haven't really talked about that at all, right? But
let's talk about.
I know. Well, we being GTA focused again, there's a lot of towers and there's a lot of single family homes and not a lot in between. I know you've talked with lots of your guests about that kind of thing. But I would like to hope that we could come up with some sort of program where those smaller form products were met with less resistance, were easier to get through the process, and there was less risk involved, so that developers like myself could consider them more readily as viable projects. Yeah, exactly.
Sure,
I get why there's big pushback over 30, 40, 50 story buildings. That's an imposing thing. But when we're talking about fourplexes or 10 plexes or mid-rise buildings, I'd like to think that as a society we could get to a place where those were seen as more beneficial and easier to get through the process than, right, as you know, you have to through the same sort of hoops to build a 30-story building as you have to do to build a 4-story building, and that's very difficult to maneuver through.
Yeah, and going back again to the whole discussion of incremental changes to regulation, like I am involved in live examples of these mid-rise buildings on major streets where, yes, you can go to a certain height with 60 units, and then if you go past a certain number of units, you get into issues with garbage collection. You already have an issue with double staircases and number of exits, and so it's like, yes, we got to the major streets and EHON initiatives, we opened some avenues, but at the same time, we can't fix the issue that we're having, that, okay, you still have to have 2 exit stairs on a 6-story building, which reduces your efficiency, which you would want it to be at like 80 to 85% ideally, reduces that from there to 72%. And that 10% margin on efficiency on a floor, it translates to your bottom line, making that project unviable. Or if you
don't worry, you only have to wait till 2030.
No, I know. I heard that the other day. I hope not. I hope not.
I hope not too.
I think the grand weight of this issue is going to hopefully push some people to wake up and say, listen, like, I think it was Jack Keys on this podcast when we were talking about the single staircase exit. He mentioned that some of those requirements, going back to the aged regulations that we have, were established when the fire department did not have the equipment they have right now.
Right.
And the sprinklers did not have the capacity that they have right now. Right. And the fire alarm and everything, and the BIS and everything else. So there's a bit of a lag, and it's a big lag. So I can go on for a while talking about those two topics.
I know we can. Yeah, I know we can.
Yeah. And
we can talk about development charges too, but I know you've beat that one to death too with previous
I don't know.
guests. So.
Like I know that the whole development charge situation is also one of those topics that, yeah, you don't want to pay, but at the same time you have all the other items that are going on in the city. Why is it that you want to build on Yonge Street or Gerrard or Sherbourne or something that's like a main artery in the city of Toronto, and your city does not have capacity to take water? The water that you technically need to discharge from the building. That's a whole different discussion. So
Sure.
I don't know. What do you think about the charges?
I think they make sense in theory. I mean, they've gone up a tremendous amount in the last while, which has added to the burden for sure. 30+% for a new home in the city of Toronto. I think it's odd also that you pay the same development charge for a 2-bedroom apartment regardless of the size or the location.
Right.
So if you wanted to build a 2-bedroom affordable unit someplace at 650 square feet, or a 2-bedroom unit of 2,000 square feet in Forest Hill, you would pay the same development charge. I think that feels strange to me. I found it strange too. I had to pay development charges when I converted some garage space in a building that was 75 years old into new apartments. That seemed odd to me. I couldn't quite understand that one.
Hey, you were developing. Welcome to the development.
Yeah, exactly. And then I just read the other day, Mike Moffat had a piece where he was talking about how when they're calculating development charges, they don't take into account the impact of the increase on whether or not construction gets done at all. So
Right.
in using economics terms, the inelasticity of the price, like they just sort of assume we can keep raising development charges and the amount of development is going to remain constant, which is
Not true.
insane.
Which is not true. Yeah, for sure.
Of course it's not true. Of course it's not true, but that's when you're doing the municipalities are doing their forecasting, they that it's a constant. And he said, I wrote this down, only 63% of the revenue from 2013 to 2019, municipalities in the GTA only collected 63% of the revenue they expected from development charges.
63. Yes.
So
that tells you the margin of error.
63%. So that's a big miss.
Yeah.
So, in the same way that can of Coke they're not going to sell the same number of cans of Coke if it costs $1,000. Development charges should be the same. So some reform on development charges, I guess, at the end of the day, I think are warranted.
Yeah, that's a good point. And who knows, maybe just leaner, more outsourced processes in the city for some of these more specialized work, because on the flip side, you're collecting the fees, but at the same time, the approvals are taking just that much longer. I don't want to name the division, but there are divisions in the city of Toronto right now that if you send them an email, you get a bounce back automatically saying that we're too busy. Don't expect a response for another 6 to 8 weeks until we get to your email, which is very bold, to say the least. Is that
is bold
to say, you know what? Don't worry. Like, we know you're making an application because you need a new service for your building, but we can't get back to you for a while. So, anyways.
Well, I suppose on the wish list, fully funded planning departments.
Yes.
Would be high on the wish list too. I'm quite sure that those people are overworked as well. So having some additional bodies there to help with the workload.
Amen. And that's that particular department that I'm talking about, which shall remain nameless. I know it has issues with staffing, and the people you talked there, they're like 2-person team dealing with tons of applications. So I can't blame them either.
Right.
But this has been fun. Thank you very much, Mike. Is there anything I haven't asked you? Do you have any final thoughts, closing ideas that you want to share with our audience?
Well, you didn't ask me about the trials and tribulations of being a landlord, but I suppose we can save that one for
why don't we go through it? Let's do that.
Another podcast.
Let's. It felt so good.
Well, let me just say,
at the beginning, I didn't want to continue down that road. So let's go through that.
Well, being a landlord is certainly can be challenging for sure, and I think that the biggest challenge around landlording is the landlord and tenant board. Maybe you've heard that before, and it's a challenge for both landlords and for tenants. Like, it's just not working for anybody, and staffing up of that would be great as well. It just takes too long for anybody to hear any of their cases. And again, that's tenants who have issues with their landlords as well as landlords who have issues with their tenants. But with respect to the housing crisis, I think it has an impact on that as well. And I can't remember who I heard it from, but to me it appears that when you make being a landlord really difficult and frankly quite risky, if it can be 8, 10, 12 months of someone just being in your basement and not paying any rent, why would anybody go through that process? So we've created these policies where people can build a garden suite, or they can build an ADU, or they can build a basement unit, but with the idea of renting it out afterwards. But then being a landlord is a risky endeavor. So I think that this is a disincentive for people to get into the business. It's also been my experience that there are bad landlords and there are bad tenants. And unfortunately, the bad tenants seem to target smaller landlords who may not be as familiar with the rules of the landlord-tenant board and how to protect themselves. And so they get targeted. So if the process doesn't help to protect those people, then just stay out of the market altogether.
Which I guess it makes sense, because going back to the earlier comment about multiplexes and being able to turn one single lot to 4 units and getting more people involved, if your risk of involvement in something like that is so high that it makes you double take and think twice, basically, and say, you know what,
right,
do I really want to deal with 4 more tenants in that property, or 3 more if you're living there?
Right.
That is a disincentive. So that might be part of the solution. I have been, I guess, fortunate enough not to have to deal with that board. I've heard a lot about it, but I've never been through the process. Do you think, is that the same as our other regulations, which is, again, a cobweb of multiple things going on and not being able to move, or is it just a matter of understaffing?
I think from my perspective, that is mostly a staffing issue. I mean, the Residential Tenancy Act is a cumbersome document for sure, which I could propose lots of improvements to that for both tenants and landlords. But if you just had more people to adjudicate the hearings that took place on a more timely basis, that would be major help. I think there's easier to get to a solution on that front than there is on the how do we build more housing front.
Okay,
yeah,
good. But one that will be helpful if you have that in place and you have a better renter landlord relationship going on. Hypothetically, you're incentivizing more people to become landlords and to put together their nest eggs and try and do something with it, not have to worry about what's going to happen 16 months into a deal or battle with someone you don't want to deal with.
It seems like a very logical choice not to convert your basement into an apartment if the risks of getting a tenant down there that is going to cost you money over a long period of time. That seems to me to be a logical conclusion to make, instead of seeing it as space you could convert in some additional income you could generate and add to the housing stock.
Right. Good point. I appreciate that you brought it up. It's not something we'd often talk about on this podcast, but definitely it's a real life experience.
Well, the point is that the construction and the development that I would like to do is to create rental housing. So the idea is to build it and then operate it as a rental property myself afterwards. And so what's going on in the rental market, what's going on in that realm is impactful for me too. It's not just I'm going to build a condo and then sell it and then move on to the next project.
And I think a lot of people are thinking like you, and with that thinking, if the legal issues with the landlord and tenants are not resolved soon enough, we're going to have way more of them on our hands in the next few years because of all the incentive for the rental projects that are happening right now. So yeah, that's a very important note, and hopefully our administration is thinking about that, and the officials are thinking about upping up and solving that issue. I very much thank you, Mike. This has been great. We learned a lot, and hopefully in a year or two we can have another episode and see how your journey is happening and how the transition has been panning out, and maybe a little bit more.
That'd be great. It's been a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Just one last thing before you leave. We've created a document called Real Estate Development Toolbox, which you can download for free from our website at realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. This document is basically the result of us asking our network and our listeners, what is the top tool that you use on a daily basis to keep yourself aware of information that's going on in the industry, the changes, the trends, the technologies, the regulations, and or if you with the tools that you use to make sure that you deliver quality results to your clients and customers, the tools that help you with productivity in what you do, and also any softwares, specialized softwares that you think are useful to share with others. So if you think there are resources that you're using on a daily basis and you would like others to know about them, please make sure to let us know, and we will make sure to include it in the next iteration of this toolbox. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this document useful.